is not your regular war video. This is a video that thousands of Ukrainians rewatched many times. This is a video where Ukraine, for the first time in its history, is using ATACMS. My name is Oleksiy Sorokin. I'm the Deputy Chief Editor of the Kyiv Independent, and let's talk about ATACMS and why this is crucial for the war. The video was first shared by General Zaluzhny, head of Ukraine's armed forces. The video allegedly shows that Ukraine has struck airfields in the occupied Berdyansk and Luhansk. Zelensky issued a statement the same day, thanking the United States and saying that ATACMS already proved themselves on the battlefield.
Сьогодні особлива вдячність Сполученим Штатам. Наші домовленості з президентом Байденом виконуються дуже влучно. ATACMS себе показали.
This was confirmed by the White House, which stated that Ukraine received ATACMS as part of the recent provision of military aid. The interesting fact here is that the US, which is really diligent with what it provides Ukraine and makes everything public, kept secret the provision of ATACMS for Ukraine to have a surprise effect on the Russian military. So what actually happened? Overnight, from Monday to Tuesday, Russian pro-war channels said that military airfields in occupied Luhansk and Berdyansk were hit by Ukrainian missiles. Later, it was revealed that Ukraine hit the airfields with ATACMS. According to Ukrainian special forces, Ukraine was able to destroy 9 helicopters, 1 air defense system, an ammunition warehouse, and a bunch of Russians. Russian Telegram channels, the pro-war ones, that are really active during this war, said that this was one of the worst hits that the Russian Air Force saw over the course of the last 20 months. Later the same day, Zelensky and Zaluzhny confirmed that this was the first successful use of ATACMS in the war. The New York Times ran a story later that day saying that Ukraine has around 20 ATACMS and the range of the missiles is 165 kilometers. What's good for Ukraine, the ATACMS provided are the older versions which contain cluster munition. The cluster ATACMS provided to Ukraine each have 950 bomblets, meaning that they can strike vast territories, imposing heavy damage on the Russians. The massive attacks on Berdyansk and Luhansk, which the pro-war channels in Russia say was the heaviest hit Ukraine has conducted on Russian Air Force since the start of the full-scale invasion, were done by only 2 or 3 ATACMS. 2 or 3, can you imagine what Ukraine can actually do if it's provided a vast amount of those missiles? So why is it so important for Ukraine? Let's talk about what's happening on the battlefield. Ukraine's counteroffensive is moving slower than expected, with Ukraine, over the past 3 months, liberating a few villages in the south and east.
Expectations have clashed against reality, and if you look at the map, results have been disappointing. Let's be honest.
The case here was the extremely tough defensive lines that Russia was able to build in the past year when the US and its allies were thinking of providing Ukraine with actual heavy weapons. Russia was able to construct minefields, trenches, and improve its logistics. So I hope I'm wrong, but there's actually little chances that Ukraine will achieve its goals in the next month or so. Since the counteroffensive is moving slower than expected, Ukraine is now also focusing on hitting logistics, railroads, air defense systems, airfields, military barracks. Everything that is behind the enemy lines, but that is vital for the Russian defenses. ATACMS is not the first long-range missile that Ukraine was able to obtain. Let's compare ATACMS to Storm Shadow. Or sorry, Scalp if you support the French. Let's compare range and the damage it can do to the Russians. Storm Shadow was provided by the UK in May, and Scalp, their French version, were provided a month later. The Storm Shadows have a range of 300 kilometers and are air-launched cruise missiles. The version of the ATACMS provided by the US has a range of 165 kilometers. The Army Tactical Missile System can be launched from the trucked M270, the Multiple Rocket Launch System, or from the HIMARS, both provided by the US earlier. The point I want to make here is that ATACMS, despite the shorter range, are cluster munitions, meaning that they can impose bigger damage on the Russians. Also means that now the pressure is on Germany to provide the big boys, the Taurus air-launched cruise missiles. The Taurus has a range of 500 kilometers, meaning that Ukraine can strike any target in the occupied parts of the country. So what happens next? Ukraine showed that it can successfully use the munitions provided by the West. This also shows that the so-called red lines that the Russians are trying to impose on Ukraine, and the red lines that many people in the West are scared of, are null and void. Russian President Putin recently said that providing ATACMS to Ukraine is an escalation, but Russia has nothing to answer with. This should open the eyes of the West that providing Ukraine with lethal weapons is not an escalation, but it actually approaches the end of this war. Even 20 ATACMS can provide a difference on the battlefield. Ukraine now has a variety of long-range missiles with which it can inflict deadly damage on the Russian troops in Ukraine. Ukraine desperately needs victories to keep the morale high and prove to the West that the weapons provided can secure Ukrainian independence. Destroying Russian logistics far from the front line is a victory for Ukraine.